Uh, Today, Dr. Andrew Harris will give the talk. His topic, the Angkor Vihara Project, mapping and excavating early Theravada Buddhist monasteries at Angkor, Cambodia. I forget to introduce myself. My name is Pipat Grajachan, a member of Council of the Siam Society. We know each other for a long time because my project in the PhD project, I work about post-Angkor or post-Bayon period. But for my project, I focus in Thailand, but his project focus in Cambodia or Angkor. Many years ago, sometimes we share our data, our evidence, and many things. Next week, he will give the presentation at a SPAFA conference. Before he coming here, I invite him because it's a good chance to know the progress of the archaeological research in Cambodia. Today, we obtain the honor to hear the recent evidence of archaeology in Cambodia. For his biography, Andrew Harris earned his PhD in anthropology, archaeology in 2021 at University of Toronto, and is currently employed as a postdoctoral research fellow in Southeast Asian archaeology and numismatics at the National University of Singapore. He is also an appointed research fellow at the Archaeology Centre of the University of Toronto or ACUT. Since 2019, Dr. Harris has served as the director of coordinator of the Angkor Vihara Project, a cooperative archaeological research program between ACUT and APSARA National Authority in Cambodia, investigating the region's transition of Angkorian society to Theravada or Theravada Buddhism through monastic construction and settlement during 13th to 16th centuries. Dr. Harris has recently published on his research in many famous journals such as World Archaeology, Asian Archaeology, Journal of Southeast Asian Studies, and Artibus Asia, with a chapter in upcoming Brill Handbook on Memory Southeast Asia. So I think it's time to start your recent research in Cambodia. Yeah, please thank you.
So thank you very much for an introduction that is well beyond what I deserve. So thank you, Dr. Pipad. And I also want to thank all of you for coming to the Siam Society, allowing me to present, to talk here tonight. If any of you are at SPAFA, which is our major archaeology conference, I'm not giving a presentation on this. I'm giving a presentation on another project I'm working on ancient coinage in early first millennium Southeast Asia. So thankfully I've been able to get my Angkor fill by coming to this talk tonight, because otherwise it would just be coins and insanity for the next little while. But anyways, as Dr. Pipad mentioned, my name again is Andrew Harris, and I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the National University of Singapore, and I'm a research fellow at the Archaeology Centre. I'm the director of the Angkor Vihara Project, which is a collaboration between the University of Toronto, which is on my alma mater, and APSARA National Authority in Cambodia. And today I've been invited to talk about some of the research we've undertaken within the ancient capital of Angkor, where we've explored a rather unique social phenomenon within the history of pre-modern Southeast Asia. which is Cambodia's collective religious transition from the practices that are essentially embodied by what we call Hinduism to Theravada or Hinayana Buddhism beginning in the 13th century. We'll specifically be discussing how this early phase of Theravada Buddhist religious practice and construction is reflected in Angkor's archaeological record, which has been observed through the spread of prayer halls, known as vihara, or in Khmer, vihear, across the Cambodian landscape, as well as the gradual end of the construction of prasat, or temples, which to that point were the all-encompassing fulcrums of Cambodian society, political religious organization, and spirituality. And our research is focused on mapping this process within Angkor's final civic-ceremonial center, which is the late 12th century walled citadel of Angkor Thom, where preah, which we call Buddhist Terraces in the archaeological record, were built in extremely high concentrations. And furthermore, this religious transition is sparsely documented within surviving epigraphy, or inscriptions, and coincided with Angkor's gradual demise in the 13th to 15th centuries. Our research has thus comprised a program of survey, mapping, excavation, and artifact analysis of preah within Angkor Thom, which, as you can imagine, has been quite an exciting endeavor. Essentially, no one's done this research before, despite over a century of work in Angkor. And finally, the project aims to contribute to the broader field of archaeology by demonstrating how religious transition, and more importantly, social change, can be interpreted through the archaeological record using material data, exploring how contemporary societies reconcile with their material past to shape the visions of their future. With that in mind, I'll begin the presentation with a brief introduction to Angkor, which will immediately lead into a discussion of the political and environmental situation which existed as Theravada Buddhism manifested within Cambodian society. And this will also include some brief summaries of passages written by the Chinese envoy Zhou Guan on the subject, who visited and wrote on Cambodia between 1296 and 1297 CE. I'll then jump into a discussion of the architecture and diacritics of Theravada Buddhist preah, the identity of what we call the reliquary, or stupa, or chedi, as a conciliative architecture between past and present, and the history of research on early Theravada Buddhist monasticism in Cambodia, the very little there is. I'll then provide a summary of archaeological fieldwork undertaken by the Angkor Vihara Project between 2017 and 2019, and post-COVID between 2022 and 2024. I'll discuss the ongoing research program, the project's early survey work and spatial analysis, and then summarize excavation work we've undertaken at 3 Buddhist terrace field sites within Angkor Thom, which represent many of the most significant inquiries and possibly answer to those inquiries that this research program has sought to investigate. And I'll end with a few conclusions, cover some next steps I think future iterations of the project can undertake. So that's sort of what we'll be covering today. But before I get started, I'd like to acknowledge that anybody who's run an excavation project knows it takes a village to run any field season, so a special thank you goes to the individuals, organizations, and funding bodies listed above, with sincerest appreciation reserved for 2 groups of people. First, Cambodia's APSARA National Authority for allowing us to conduct research in the Angkor Archaeological Park, and second, our team of workers from Preah Village, including our foreman Loon Liep, who they are the bedrock of what we do, and without them, none of this would be possible. So even if they're not hearing this, thank you to all of those individuals. So to begin, the Angkorian or Khmer Empire was a geopolitical entity which at its peak encompassed all of Cambodia and much of Thailand, Laos, and southern Vietnam from the 9th to the 15th centuries. The polity was centered on the region of Angkor, which was an expansive 1,000 square kilometer, low-density agro-urban area centered on the region of what we call the Yashodharapura, which was named after Angkor's first regional king Yashovarman I. And this features most but not all of the Angkorian Empire's monumental political religious construction. The construction itself was facilitated by the rule of successive universal monarchs known as Chakravartin, who were imbued with divine essence, typically of the god Shiva, but also at times of Vishnu or of Buddhist saints known as Bodhisattva. The king would have manifested his rule over agriculture, water, and the living forces of the landscape in part through the construction of a temple mountain that formed the physical and metaphorical pivot of royal religious rulership, and also contained stone-etched inscriptions in Sanskrit which covered his life and deeds, which is where we get the majority of our historical information about the Angkorian Empire. Temple mountains formed the pivot of a vast landscape of satellite temple complexes which both influenced and dictated urban, agrarian, and hydraulic development through their administration by local Brahmanical-aligned elites. And from the archaeological record, we know that Angkor's engineers channeled water from the Kulen Hills to the northwest through an interconnected system of canals, reservoirs, and ponds, which contributed to the success of the empire's harvest. This architecture, or the infrastructure, was supported by vast earthworks, including walls, embankments, roads, all surrounded by a massive infrastructure of undocumented wooden buildings. The area of Angkorian history we're going to cover today will be its final centuries, which is the period during which Theravada Buddhism became institutionalized as a state religion and linchpin of Cambodian culture. Buddhism, like Hinduism, had been present in Cambodia since the late first half of the first millennium, but up until the 13th century was primarily practiced as what is known as Mahayana Buddhism, and some very brief differences between Mahayana and Theravada Buddhism are listed on the slide here. To back up a second, though, this label of Mahayana Buddhism that's been given has become blurrier in the past few decades as scholarship has further investigated the religious pluralism of Angkor's population. And recent inscriptional evidence has suggested that many of Cambodia's kings were Buddhist, despite overseeing regional power structures based on elite veneration of Shiva. An outwardly Buddhist monarch of note was the late 12th century King Jayavarman VII, who commissioned a vast volume of inscriptions across hundreds of new and restored monuments, proclaiming the commitment to curing the suffering of his people through massive infrastructural building projects that facilitated Buddhist worship of various schools, Mahayana, Vajrayana, or esoteric Buddhism, and possibly even Theravada, across the empire from Pimai to Wat Phu, with Angkor in between. And one of these projects was Angkor Thom, which is the Jayavarman VII's walled citadel, it is in the heart of central Angkor, measuring 3 by 3 kilometers and surrounded by an inner and outer moat. Angkor Thom was constructed as a manifestation of the churning of the ocean of milk myth of Indic mythology and centered on the enigmatic Bayon Temple Mountain, which sits at the convergence of 4 of the 5 of the citadel's main roads. Each of these roads culminates in an enormous gate with striking face towers, and the Devas and Asuras, the massive statues that line either side, complete the symbolism of the churning of the ocean of milk, as these two sets of ethereal beings essentially churned the serpent Vasuki around a churning post and created the elixir of life. The Bayon, which has 216 of these gigantic faces itself, serves as a pantheon not only for Mahayana Buddhist worship, but also for the veneration of various Hindu deities. It was, in its most essence word, a pantheon. Angkor Thom, the city, is crisscrossed by an orthogonal road grid alongside a sophisticated hydraulic system of canals and moats, which dictated the construction of new settlement. But its placement was also influenced by its incorporation of an earlier political hub centered on Angkor's 10th century royal palace. There's our pointer here. You can see the 5th road here. This would have gone from the royal palace, which is here, all the way out to a massive reservoir known as the East Barai, and ends at a jetty that is shaped like a cross. And if any of you have gone to Angkor and not seen that, it's actually a really interesting trek through the forest. Angkor Thom finally is also home to the overwhelming majority of archaeological evidence for early Theravada Buddhist activity within Angkor. Theravada Buddhism, meanwhile, is not a religious tradition that was developed within Cambodia until its introduction in the 13th century. In fact, what's found in Cambodia is derived from Southeast Asian interpretations of Sinhalese or Sri Lankan Buddhism, and like Hinduism, also incorporated ancestral deities and perceptions of the sacredness of the landscape. Apart from the polities in central and southern Myanmar, which were either Mon or Pew, depending on the debate, who had been practicing Buddhists since the final centuries BCE, it's thought that polities representative of the Dwarvati material culture across central and eastern Thailand had been Buddhist since at least the 6th century, and were instrumental to the transmission of all of the sects or schools of Buddhism eastward into Cambodia over time. Dwarvati polities, which were thought to be smaller kingdoms, were typically situated on the frontiers of larger imperial bodies, for example, the Khmer of Angkor and the Burmese of Pagan, and historical and architectural evidence suggests they were incorporated frequently within the boundaries of both polities. And the rise of Theravada Buddhism in the 13th and 15th century coincided with events that destabilized Angkor, leading to its demise. Following the death of Jayavarman VII, civil strife and elite conflict are thought to have ensued, marked by the iconoclasm of Buddhist images on Jayavarman VII era temples and a return to Hindu or Shaivite rule under Jayavarman VIII. No new civic ceremonial centers were built after Angkor Thom, partly in part due to lack of quarried sandstone from the Kulen Hills. monumental stone temple construction subsequently ceased, with the last temple, the Mangalartha, dedicated in 1295. Environmental studies suggest that megadroughts and mega monsoons in the 14th to 15th centuries severely damaged Angkor's overused and fragile hydrology. Canals that once filled the massive reservoirs, or borai, ceased to function or were damaged by floods. And evidence from several excavations indicate that many water bodies were re-excavated as stagnant tanks, servicing local populations. There's also currently debate as to whether Angkor's monarchs and elite populations left the region entirely prior to the 15th century, departing Angkor for a series of capitals surrounding modern Phnom Penh, where they ruled for the next 4 centuries. This in part may have been due to the opportunities to accumulate considerable wealth through the maritime trade which ran through the Mekong Delta, which itself may have been a necessity given the collapse of Angkor's fairly insular, low-density agro-urban system. Mirroring this, excavation into the occupation mounds of many civic-ceremonial centers also suggests notable decreases of population across Greater Angkor, and population or urban settlement may have constricted in only a few areas, including potentially Angkor Thom. This narrative of collapse traditionally culminates with the expansion of the Kingdom of Ayutthaya, which, according to Thai sources, definitively sacked Angkor in 1431, but more likely occupied Angkor for a period of 10 to 15 years in the mid-15th century. Ayutthaya is thought to have embodied the same cosmological social hierarchy as Hindu Angkor, with standardized replications of architecture, divine rulership rites, and the construction of large temple mountains, or prang. Ayutthaya's expansion in might for the next 4 centuries now serves as important evidence, actually, to counter previous interpretations that the Angkorian state's adoption of Theravada Buddhism led to its downfall. Historical accounts and inscriptions exist rather sporadically during this period, and while they speak very little about the conflicts of Angkor's final centuries, they do provide key information to help interpret early Theravada Buddhist practices and material culture. The first account of a widespread Buddhist tradition at Angkor comes from the writings of Chinese envoy Joda Guan, entitled The Customs of Cambodia. Joda Guan arrived at Angkor in 1296 and, through a somewhat fragmented perception of foreign customs, observed as many as 3 practicing religious traditions within Angkor Thom. Brahmins, who he named specifically, worshippers venerating a block of stone, either venerators of Shiva through the worship of Shiva Lingam, or either even ancestral animist veneration, and most recognizably Buddhists. It doesn't necessarily specify what sect, but their monks wore saffron robes and worshipped in large images of the Buddha in roofed halls, which is actually the first mention of any structure resembling what we found in the archaeological record. Joda Guan also importantly notes that every family practiced Buddhism, which suggests that the construction of the Mangalartha a year earlier was the product of just one of the traditions being practiced at Angkor rather than some overnight flick of the switch, as it's somewhat alluded to in early scholarship. Indravarman III, the ruling king, was also a practicing Buddhist, and Joe notes that generally when leaving or returning to the palace, he had to visit a small gold pagoda with a Buddha in front of it. Onlookers all had to kneel down and touch their head on the ground. Theravada practice after this point is thought to have continuously gained ground in Cambodia as a religion widely practiced across all social classes, and from the 14th century onward, rulership appears to be less tied to any connection with Hindu deities. Also by the 14th century, Angkor's epigraphy had very gradually transitioned from Sanskrit to Pali, the canon language of Sinhalese Buddhism, and an inscription exists from 1309 at Kok Svai Chek Temple in northwestern Cambodia, describing the king's abdication for the life of a bhikkhu or a monk, which does seem unprecedented as the king typically died in his position if he wasn't overthrown. The inscription also notes his gifting of land for the construction of a vihara, as well as donation of several Buddha images, which represents a common practice of merit-making in Cambodian Theravada tradition, which from inscriptions we also know was also common to earlier Hindu and Mahayana Buddhist practices, and really Buddhist practice the world over. The last documented inscription to Shiva at Angkor appears on the Bayan from 1327, which is indeed noteworthy as a dedication to a Hindu king following the arrival of Theravada Buddhism, or at least the adoption of it. This suggests that religious plurality existed within Angkor well into the 14th century, and thus religious transition, of course, becomes a process that is far less cut and dried than is usually presented. This new tradition also appears to have necessitated a new form of religious monument, structures which have been the focus of our research for the past 7 years. With Angkorian archaeology, we refer to these distinct structures as either preah, the Khmer translation of vihara, as I mentioned, or Buddhist Terraces, a translation of the French classifier terrasse bouddhique. The distinction, though, is, even if these terms are used interchangeably, is that Buddhist terraces comprise the archaeological substructural remains, and preah vihear represent the buildings or areas in which Buddhist rites were performed. We've coincidentally classified each site as Angkor Terrace Vihear, or ATV. You can see ATV 001. These monuments appear to architecturally and ritually spatially derive from structures found within Buddhist polities in northern Thailand or central Thailand, such as Sukhothai, which was the first Thai kingdom established in the late 13th century, or even Lopburi, otherwise known as Lavo or Lavarpura, which sat within the peripheral areas of both Angkor and Sukhothai, and feature a unique conglomeration of Khmer and Thai Hindu Buddhist and Theravada monuments and artworks spanning the 11th to 15th centuries. Jodagwan's writings also indicate the establishment of preah vihear predates Ayutthayan influence in the 15th century in Angkor, but the architectural variation between structures would suggest many of the monastic buildings found within Angkor Thom were built during what is believed to be Angkor's mid-15th century occupation by Ayutthaya. Archaeologically, Buddhist terraces collectively comprise the surviving tiered sandstone and laterite foundations of tiled, roofed wooden preah vihear, which have not survived in the archaeological record. Each terrace is typically eastward facing, derivative of the positioning of Hindu temples and veneration of Shiva, as well as in reverence to the rising sun, while veneration is directed towards a large statue of the Buddha on a raised block pedestal known as a balang. The pedestal would have been typically surrounded by smaller wooden statues, which were likely donated as acts of merit-making by local elites or general populations. Because only the substructural remains have survived, an important goal of our research has been to collectively understand what the superstructures of these buildings might have looked like. And we have really four major sources of evidence. The first, fairly evidently, is comparisons of the surviving structural remains with modern Cambodian Wat or Vihara architecture, which have changed very little since ancient times, apart from, for example, building in concrete. The second are reliefs of palatial scenes and depictions of wooden shrines on temples such as the Bayon in the lower right, which have been used to re-envision structures such as the Royal Palace at Angkor, but also used in the art historical reconstructions of buildings in the later capitals north of Phnom Penh by scholars such as Madeleine Guiteau. The third comes specifically from Jodagwan's writings. As I mentioned previously, he actually described buildings that looked like this. But he notes also that Buddhist populations were allowed to use tile in their buildings. And this is important because he notes that this was a sumptuary law that only permitted the roofs of elite, royal, or religious buildings to be constructed in tile. Finally, fourth is the sheer abundance of these roof tiles we found at Buddhist terrace sites as part of surface collections and during excavations, the results of which are documented in the map on the upper right. And these results also account for the unique figural tiles, like the one on the left, that depict Buddhist figures, which have been found in excavation contexts at two preah vihear sites as of 2024. The most significant religious diacritic of these preah vihear are sima, a series of blessed stone orbs or other deposits which are used to demarcate ordination spaces within a Theravada monastery. Angkorian monastic communities adopted the earlier Dvaravati tradition of erecting prominent stone markers over these deposits, as well as you can see here later styles from Ayutthaya, which are known as nimira or sima stones. We call them sima stones, and they're placed at the cardinal and subcardinal boundaries of the monastery. Sima, in fact, have been the single most consistent classifier of these former sites during survey, and as you can see here, they show significant variation in both their style and their craftsmanship. This Sima delineated area makes up one of two major ritual structures within any complex. Many Buddhist terraces, or many preah vihear, feature a separate but equally important sanctuary, which we call a reliquary, which is known better across the Buddhist world as a stupa. And this serves as a spiritual repository for statuary, funerary remains, and other offerings. Reliquaries either stand as separate structures or attached to the Buddhist terrace, and if present, sit directly west on a central axis between the Balang and the eastern and westernmost Sima stones. Studies on reliquaries at Angkor since the 20th century identified two main forms. The first, here, we call a preah and resembles a small prasat, where you have here a traditional bell-shaped chedi, and this latter form was likely introduced to Cambodia later as a product of growing Thai influence on Angkorian architecture. The later capital centers of Longvek, Sri Santhor, and Udong, all north of modern Phnom Penh, feature these chedi in abundance. We also have smaller single interment funerary stupas built surrounding many prominent Buddhist terrace structures and temples, for example, surrounding the Bayon, but because reliquaries have often been destroyed by looters down to their foundations, these little funerary stupas actually are quite important for helping us envision what the original superstructures look like. Previous studies of reliquary monuments have also helped us highlight the afterlives of many Hindu or Mahayana Buddhist temples across the Angkorian landscape, which were at various points converted into reliquary monuments themselves. Readings of 15th to 17th century epigraphy by scholars such as Ashley Thompson ascribe that these temple conversions had similar meaning to those that were purpose-built, and in a similar manner often feature a preah vihear in close proximity or directly abutting the monument. This is the case here with arguably Angkor's most famous converted temple aside from Angkor Wat, which we'll get to in a minute, which is West Prasat Top Temple. This was a 9th to 10th century temple to Shiva that was converted into a Buddhist sanctuary that we have carbon dates for, thanks to the West Prasat Top project by Nara from the late 13th century to the early 15th century. And through their anastylosis of the monument, we know actually that the temple was converted first, then a northern and a southern small tower or reliquary were built on either side, and then finally a Buddhist terrace was built fronting this temple, and it still allowed access surrounding this major ritual element into the now converted reliquary. As localized acts, each conversion appears to reflect the resources and elite donor power available to the populations surrounding the temples at the time of their conversion. And some changes may have been as non-intrusive as adding friezes to a cella, and while others, such as the 11th century Bapuan temple here, resulted in the complete destruction and reconstruction of the central towers into a monumental image of the Buddha, which through carbon dating of iron crampons embedded in the statue, we know occurred at this specific temple at some point in the mid-15th century. However, despite the variation in scale, each conversion also appears to reflect the implementation of a consistent and standardized Theravada Buddhist iconography, one that may have not been indigenous to the centuries of artistic development found at Angkor. Instead, these images, each depicting episodes from the life of the Buddha, indicate the growing influence from powerful Thai city-states to the west, such as Ayutthaya and Sukhothai during this period, as well as important artistic innovations at Lopburi, which unfortunately I don't have enough time to cover today. The most noteworthy temple conversion occurred, many of you know, in the mid-16th century at the Great Temple of Angkor Wat, which was transformed from a defunct temple to Vishnu built in the 12th century into a Buddhist pilgrimage site by the royal family of King Angchan, who now resided in Longvek. Although carbon dates from occupation mounds excavated by Alison Carter, the Greater Angkor Project, suggests the temple was reoccupied during the 15th century, a volume of inscriptions dated 1546 onwards commemorate Angchan's official repatronage of the temple, an event that's actually corroborated by European accounts from the late 16th century. Scholars have determined that Angchan likely commissioned the completion of several bas-reliefs within the temple's outer enclosure, while his immediate descendants reconsecrated the earlier Vishnu Cella as a reliquary by blocking up the four entrances with friezes of the Buddha and regilding the central towers. And offerings of statuary by wealthy elites and government officials are also denoted through inscription within the temple, which were primarily placed here in Preah, or the Hall of 1,000 Buddhas. This image dates from very early in the 20th century, and most of these statues have been removed. If you go there now, it actually looks quite barren in comparison. But they are now both in the Angkor National Museum and the Angkor Conservation Office, which are in Siem Reap. Writings in Japanese in black ink throughout the temple, as well as a 17th century map of Angkor Wat created by Japanese pilgrims, also help us understand Angkor Wat's new established role as an international Buddhist pilgrimage site. And Angkor Wat's restoration falls within a period of Cambodian history spanning the 15th to 19th centuries, known as the post-Angkorian, early modern, or middle period, where in essence Theravada Buddhist kings ruling from capital centers north of Phnom Penh were generally subordinate to the political interests of their neighbors until Cambodia was absorbed into French Indochina in 1863. Cambodia's perceived insignificance during this period, juxtaposed with its former Angkorian glory, alongside the acrimonious relationship between early 20th century colonial officials and the leadership of Cambodia's Sangha, her monastic order, led French linguists and architects such as Jules Sidés, Louis Finot, and Henri Marchal to essentially denounce post-Hindu customs, traditions, and historical remains of this latter period as inferior, and thus a distinct historical epoch to what came before, with no connection. In fact, until recently, all Theravada Buddhist remains found in Angkor were collectively seriated to this later period without any further assessment. And this perception has changed over the last 3 decades as the field has become more interdisciplinary, and rereadings of historical texts, ethnographic research, and archaeological excavations into settlement by scholars such as Ashley Thompson, Hang Bupal, Alison Carter, Miriam Stark, Martin Polkinghorne, and we'd like to think ourselves, have provided necessary nuance to the historical processes and the role of the vihara in both ancient and modern Cambodian society, which is where our fieldwork fits in. With this focus in mind, the research program I've directed since 2017 in Angkor essentially sought to reboot research on preah vihear spaces through archaeological investigations of Buddhist terraces, which would both complement and enhance ongoing studies of temple conversion and landscape changes at Angkor, which defined the first centuries of early Theravadin Cambodia. This research, which began during my PhD, has become the Angkor Vihara Project. Our fieldwork between 2017 and 2024 is listed above, although we'll briefly discuss 2024 as we have not submitted our report to APSARA authority yet. The abundance of Buddhist terrace remains within Angkor Thom made the citadel the most logical place to begin a large-scale investigation of this architecture and settlement. As we deal with often heavily looted, heavily disturbed sites shrouded in jungle overgrowth, we began with an extensive survey and catalog of all documented Buddhist terrace sites within Angkor Thom and central Angkor between 2017 and 2018. To complete this work, we utilized 20th century colonial maps overlaid with existing GIS and LiDAR data, and succeeded in mapping a far more expansive landscape of this type of construction that was previously acknowledged. In this map here, it illustrates that we identified 72 Buddhist terrace ruins within the citadel alone, which is a number I still believe is understated given all the fragmentary lines of laterite blocks we mapped in the forest, as well as a growing list at satellite civic-ceremonial centers you can see here, Angkor Wat, Bantikide, Taprom, Phray Khan, or solitary structures primarily surrounding Angkor Wat. Beyond simply identifying dilapidated monastic structures in the jungle, our survey and mapping work has provided a unique opportunity to use Buddhist terrace placement within the citadel to assess Angkor Thom's urban development during its later history. This focus also provides another method by which we can assess trends of temple conversion through this construction on a macro scale, complementing existing architectural investigations from single sites with a broader landscape analysis. For instance, despite the absence of inscriptions compared to Angkor Wat, it's been known for years that the Bayon formed the pivot of another significant Theravada Buddhist complex, with various iconographic and structural augmentations found within the temple, indicating its conversion to a reliquary at some point after the 14th century. This temple also forms the focal point of a concentric layout of Buddhist terraces, many of which were likely constructed from blocks salvaged from this temple or earlier monuments. And keep in mind here that the Bayon was likely still perceived as a civic-ceremonial pivot of Angkor Thom's urban landscape. That said, the architectural variation between each Buddhist terrace is noteworthy and suggests this layout was likely created gradually by multiple factions rather than, say, a single commission by a king or elite like Jayavarman VII's Mahayana Buddhist monuments. And furthermore, it's also possible that many of these structures were revisited over time as population waxed and waned within Angkor. This framework and focus has also led to some interesting new interpretations of the Bayon's infrastructure or supporting infrastructure that had been hiding in plain sight for centuries. Last year, we established the rather unique use of sema stones and the floor paving of a small image house, you can see here, just south of the Bayon, it's East Causeway, while shooting total station points towards one of our excavation sites. The area around the building had been drawn and excavated as recently as 2014, but the use or even the presence of the sema wasn't acknowledged in the team's drawn site plans. Now, you can easily write this off as a practical use of stone, but a similar use of sema stones was discovered when the southern tower of West Prasat Top was deconstructed by the Japanese team from Nara currently overseeing the temple's restoration. And it seems like what you have here is a very unique ritual reuse of sema stones that has not necessarily been identified outside of this area within Angkor Thom. Another important example is a staggered line of Buddhist terraces spanning Angkor Thom's entire longitudinal thoroughfare, which is only interrupted by the Bayon and the royal palace. Interestingly, Zhou Daguan attributes some significance to at least the southern portion of this route in his writings, as you can see in the quote here. And it's quite interesting because you would never know these were here. Anybody who's taken a tuk-tuk or a car up this road, these are all about anywhere between 20 to 50 meters embedded in the forest. And we've called this alignment the North-South Gate Road Zigzag, and have yet to find a better name for it. Meanwhile, this thoroughfare features many structures with fired brick remains, and bricks, interestingly, had been used comparatively sparingly in Angkorian architecture since the late 10th or early 11th century, when temples were predominantly constructed with sandstone and laterite. And it's therefore bricks may have been reintroduced en masse to Angkor A by means of expanding Ayutthayan influence from the 15th century, where brick and plaster construction during this period are abundant, and B, as an alternative to recycled stone when quarried stone was less accessible. We've thus far excavated at 2 of the structures along this route, with vihear habitation dated firmly to the 14th century. But the presence of bricks, especially as renovations and expansions, points to a longer history of this thoroughfare than carbon dates might imply. Now, for the remainder of the presentation, I'm going to focus on the results of our excavation fieldwork. Over 4 seasons between 2019 and again in 2022 and 2024, we excavated a total of 30 trenches and test pits across 7 Buddhist terrace sites within Angkor Thom, clearing and mapping an additional 3. Our goals in excavating these sites were initially to investigate ritual features such as sema and architectural variation as representative of larger trends we noted during survey, but eventually expanded our scope to assess building phases, reliquary structures, and surrounding occupation. So for the next 15 minutes or so, I'm going to discuss our excavation of 3 of the Buddhist terrace sites we investigated around Angkor Thom. First, we call ATV 12 on the West Gate Road. So our second was ATV 30, which is our major reliquary investigation, just south of the East Gate Road. And ATV 9 near the Bayan, which is the focus of our excavations in 2023 and 2024, when it was an absolute gift of a site. And sadly, we won't be discussing more than half these, including ATV 27, which I will refer to through the presentation as we did get some carbon dates from this site. But we excavated here between 2019 and 2022, and I was telling Dr. Pipad recently, we found this really amazing incomplete Buddha along with a cracked sema stone, and we're wondering whether this site might have been at a later statue workshop, as statues were no longer carved in the Royal Palace workshop that has been the site of several excavations. So at some point we'd like to get back and maybe firm up that hypothesis. You'll probably also notice that we were primarily confined to sites that were accessible by road for this phase of the project, given that we were hauling a truck full of equipment. Although in the future I'm hoping that we can venture deeper into the forest to look at some of the more remote sites we surveyed. We'll first start with ATV 12, which is a small Buddhist terrace 400 meters north of West Prasat Top on the West Gate Road. It comprised a small vihara with a prominent porch built on a small flat mound surrounded by laterite boundary wall and well-carved sema stones, and was fronted by a causeway of unknown function. It also features the balang has been destroyed, but as you can see here, what is remaining of the area is fallen to the north, possibly through looting, and has several statue pedestals. We also found our largest statue remain of the excavation season, or of the campaign until this year, which was a 1.5 tall meter elephant statue, which its head was here in 2019. During COVID, the head was stolen. We'd like to know where it went. But at one point, it would have formed a pair at the base of the steps. ATV 12 was our first major excavation of the Angkor Vihara Project, and helped us better understand the artifactual assemblages of these structures, as well as understanding building phases as reflective of the history of the site. So this is a really important site for us first starting out when we were doing our initial project. We dug 3 trenches here, and I'm going to cover 2 of them today. This one here is 1000, which we dug in between the corner of the inner prayer hall and to expose the terrace's inner staircase, as well as a feature that we call a southern lateral aisle, which Henri Marchal says was a raised tract for the monks, and they actually appear at a lot of Thai monasteries where the monks would step over the congregation, meditate there, or recite and chant there. And we know that this was installed in recycled sandstone at some point after the initial construction of the privy here. We were able to tell this was a later feature due to how mismatched the blocks are. See them a little here, and they don't adjoin with the original laterite foundations, which suggests at some point a population added this feature or came back and restored the structure with this feature. We also found 2 distinct layers of roof tiles in the trench. The first, you can see the remains here, marked the sat on top of the terrace, we think, while the other here was about 70 centimeters lower and has features of different glaze, which suggests the site was in some way significant prior to the construction and dedication of the preah vihear. This was partially validated when we excavated Trench 2000 along the causeway, where we found a quartz foundation stone, which was attached to some charcoal, and through carbon dating we identified it as a late 11th to early 12th century deposit. And our field work and other projects have found significant numbers of these little stones at other sites. We know this is significant as a votive object, and one of the most important new discoveries in Angkor was in the middle of what is known as Srasrang Reservoir in the east of the park, was found in Mebon, or a temple island, where not only was there evidence of a small structure that resembled a stupa, but also there was a stone turtle surrounded by hundreds of these quartz foundation stones. So this actually helps that find actually helped contextualize what we found here, and every year in different contexts we found one of these stones. Now I'll just give you a quick tangent. I want to talk a little bit about the Chinese ceramics we excavated across all of our excavation sites, including here at ATV 12. Like statuary, these vessels were likely donations by wealthy patrons and in fact represent one of the few imported trade goods found consistently in Angkorian period excavations. The ones we found fall into two major categories: various blue and green glazed monochrome celadons, which Zhou Daguan notes were highly valued in Cambodia, and white Qingbai wares, which were likely fired along the southern coast in Fujian. And there's a very good dissertation by David Brotherson on these export wares. The Chinese ceramics we found in our excavation also appear to demarcate the upper limit of this ceramic export into Angkor, and thus each site, and thus occupation, as there are almost no later blue and white export wares found anywhere in Angkor except in stratigraphic layers corresponding with the 16th century onwards, for example, Angkor Wat. In Trench 3000, we explored the area just outside the outer foundations parallel to 1000 and found numerous roof tiles as well as brown glaze wares, which we know marks the 11th to 14th century occupation and activity on Angkorian sites. We also found a hard-packed layer of sandstone chips, you can see here, with a small hole that was likely a post mold for wooden supports. And below the mold was a nail, likely a fastening nail or a roofing nail, and this lovely rim of a bronze vessel, which was placed into the post hole most likely as a votive deposit. And the carbon dates from the final strata of this trench helped us to establish the base level occupation of the site, which is the late 10th, early 11th century, which coincides with the possible construction of the royal palace, or the initial construction. The second site here, AGV 30, is a Buddhist terrace 100 meters south of Angkor Thom's Eastgate Road, equidistant, or 700 meters, 50 meters from the Bayon, and is one of three preah vihears surrounding what we call Trapang Rong Dam Ray, which is this set of ponds. It is one pond, but it's a set of ponds. Trapang Rong Dam Ray in Khmer means pond of the elephants. And these were all originally classified by the French as an interconnected group. It's not clear whether that's true. The ATV 30 complex is built entirely in laterite within an embankment wall compound, measuring, you can see a little bit of an embankment outline here, measuring 50 by 20 meters, and comprises two main elements. The first is a completely destroyed Buddhist terrace on the west side surrounded by small sema stones, while the second is a prominent reliquary with the remains of a stupa and its associated rings scattered to the west side. Despite how it looks, ATV 30 is actually one of the few reliquary monuments within Angkor Thom that hasn't been completely destroyed by looters, crushed by trees, or within proximity to a major temple. We excavated ATV 30 in successive seasons between 2022 and 2023 to learn more about how the reliquary was constructed through an investigation of its foundations and structural debris, and this was in part to determine whether we could find a datable foundation deposit in the southwest corner, which was the only intact corner. We originally thought that the reliquary fronted the terrace and that the west face features a staircase, but it appears as if the structure was looted to the west, which means that ATV 30 represents one of the few west-facing preah vihear at Angkor Thom, and we're not quite sure the significance of that as of yet. We were also successful in finding a small foundation deposit of stones. These were found alongside bone and charcoal, which we're getting ready to carbon date in the next year, so we'll likely know potentially how old exactly the reliquary was, which is quite rare for a site like this. And finally, we uncovered several earlier post holes, as well as earlier ceramics, which suggests that the embankment the terrace is built within was home to an earlier elite or religious occupation similar to ATV-12, and for that evidence we have roof tiles. And I'll give another comparison, bring you back to ATV-27, which was the site that we couldn't cover today. This is also one of the Trapang Rongdam Ray sites, and it was also built within an enclosed embankment. And carbon dates and ceramics from that site date the initial occupation there to the 11th century. So it's possible this embankment area and what we have at ATV-30 dates earlier than the two reliquary sites and might even be connected. We also performed some electromagnetic susceptibility readings on the structure's laterite blocks of the reliquary to determine whether the larger blocks on top tentatively represented a later or different phase of construction, which, just based on the structural differences, we did anticipate during survey. And as predicted, the readings between the molded layer and the larger blocks indeed differ, which suggests that the superstructure of the reliquary was transformed during a later period from something more resembling the tower of a prasat, and then the crenellation in the rings of the stupa spire on the previous slide might date to a later period as well. And we have observed this trend of blocking up certain monuments at other reliquaries across Angkor Thom. As you can see here, this is actually the Buddhist terrace where to the east holds the Bayan Buddha, the original Bayan Buddha, which was found in a well in the 1930s. But from old photographs, this blocked up area looks like it was originally an access staircase and in fact appears in those photographs. So that was something that was done before the renovation of the terrace into something to hold the Bayan Buddha. And you also have it at temples such as Angkor Wat, as you remember me saying, had its Vishnu Cella closed up in the late 16th century, and as well at Wat Nakor in Kampong Cham province in southern Cambodia, where the doorways were sealed with statues of the Buddha, and the spire was turned into a lovely chedi, which is commemorated in an inscription. And one theory we've been exploring is that the renovation of ATV-30's reliquary superstructure coincided with a general closure of many monuments across Angkor at some point after the 15th century, although it's not quite clear why, and it's also not quite clear how the monument was accessed, at least in ATV-30's case, as we never firmly identified an original staircase. Our final site, as I mentioned, the gem of a site, ATV-9 was the major focus of our 2023 and 2024 campaigns after we cleared it in 2022. It's 60 meters long and 30 meters wide at its longest and widest, and sits 180 meters from the Bayon on Angkor's East Gate Road. But the forest between the site and the Bayon doesn't easily convey the construction between the two structures, which is how we were able to avoid the politics of excavating so close to the Bayon. And as you can see in the schematic, the Buddhist terrace comprises two main features separated by a notable juncture. The first is a cruciform terrace that resembles the base of a temple, while the second is a lateral rectangular terrace made of recycled stone blocks. The structure is surrounded by two funerary monuments, as you can see here, and then this very unique structure that we call the north-facing reliquary. There's actually no structure like this anywhere within Angkor. And the Balang, highlighted in red, is also further east of where it typically sits, as rather than at the western extremity of the entire structure, it's been placed at the western extremity of the lateral terrace. So that was something majorly we wanted to look at. The trenches we excavated across ATV-9 served to understand the architectural development of the Buddhist terraces, or Buddhist terrace, including features we thought were renovations, as well as providing concentrated studies of supporting infrastructure. As you can see here in the case of Trench 7000, where we excavated this lovely north-facing reliquary, which you can see very much resembles the steps of a temple. But excavations we did this year actually verified that this was not the remains of something that came before, and was likely recycled and carved from something else, or reconstructed from blocks of an original monument that no longer exists. We also looked at landscape and the development of the site over time, which is our goal of this site here, Trench 2000, where we dug into a massive refuse pit and found more complete ceramics than I've ever found in an excavation, including ceramics like chongak wares, which are from a specific kiln in southern Cambodia, which date far earlier, or supposedly date far earlier than this vihara would have been constructed. At this site, we excavated 15 trenches in total, but I'm going to highlight two of our most important from the 2023 campaign, which are 4,000, 5,000, and 1,000. Trench 4,000 and 5,000 we excavated above and below the juncture. This is just the other side of it. This is the south side. This is the north side of the cruciform and lateral elements of the structure. 5,000 here revealed that the juncture goes all the way down to the bottom of the structure, which means that there is no overlap in what we're seeing in the paving on the exposed paving is in fact what is visible underground. And 4,000 meanwhile revealed a buried staircase. As you can see here, I'm going to show a video in a minute of how those excavations evolved in 2024. This established that the staircase stretched all the way across the terrace, and importantly, the burial of the staircase under a layer of earthen fill with collapsed roof tiles on top is also curious and suggests that this feature may represent an earlier phase of access between the older and newer elements of the terrace, and thus was partially dismantled when the terrace was expanded eastward. Trench 1,000, meanwhile, was excavated through the center of the cruciform structure to initially determine whether there was a flagstone floor. There's other cruciform-shaped structures in Angkor. Most of them are what are known as mandapa or mandap, which were ceremonial areas fronting Hindu temples. Instead, above the structure's roof, which was represented in metric tons of roof tiles, we found a rectangular assemblage of blocks that we initially thought comprised the remains of the terrace's older balang, even if it was incorrectly positioned compared to other vihear, like right in the center rather than at the western edge. Instead, we now believe that these blocks demarcate a reliquary burial on top of the terrace, which comprised a deposit of numerous statue fragments adjacent to two Chinese jarlets, including one very rare blue and white vessel. These jarlets were later verified to contain ash and bone, or human remains, and thus we reinterred them with the help of a local achar, or Buddhist spiritual medium, because the site and its corporeal remains are still seen as sacred by local people. And the excavation of this burial reliquary suggests that the cruciform event of 1809 was at some point re-envisioned as a center of inhumation. And the repositioning of the balang to the east actually makes sense if the boundaries of the Buddhist terrace were to be perceived to end before this point. It's therefore probable that populations reoccupied this site as a vihara, maybe even in the post-Angkorian period, or even came across this site following its abandonment and perceived it as continuously sacred. And in 2024, we investigated these ideas a little further. At the beginning of our excavations in February, we decided to run a ground-penetrating radar survey over the top of the cruciform terrace to determine whether there was indeed evidence of an earlier pedestal below ground at the western extremity. We set trench 12,000 down on top of a very, very promising reading and found essentially what we've been looking for in 2023. 20 centimeters west of where we've been excavating previously. That does happen sometimes. And these were the foundations of the earlier balang, and within them were the stone block remains of a monumental deity. You can see here by the adjoined sandstone block that was likely topped their feet, which was consecrated by a ritual layer of sand. As you can see here, that's actually very common within Angkorian architecture. Any ritual feature would have had a dug sand layer. But the GPR, ground penetrating radar, showed that this sand layer went down 5 meters. So we decided to not excavate further, given the danger of the collapse digging into pure sand, and as my colleague Chai Rachna said, it would become a thing. And what I mean by a thing means that we would have to get a massive crane, excavate there for 3 extra weeks, and pull all of the statue fragments out so that they could reconstruct it. So we all said, you know what, we're going to leave it there. If any other team wants to come back to it in the future, go ahead. But this is what we found, and this is kind of the evidence of what would have originally stood on the older balang. There's also a number of these larger statues at other Buddhist terraces in Angkor Thom, but we measured the dimensions of the blocks, and this is far larger than any of them, and is also one of the few that would have been standing. Most of the ones that you find at the Buddhist terraces around the Bayon and around a major one called Tep Pranam, they're seated. They're seated. They have they're in Bhumi Sparsha Mudra, which is earth-touching mudra, and they would have been in blocks as well. But here we have one based on the feet that would have been standing. It would have either had one hand or 2 hands, the dispelling of fear, or a Bhaya Mudra. And that is very rare. There is one that exists just west of what's called Tep Pranam, but it's not as close to as large. So had we gone to excavate this, it would have been a big deal, but at the same time would have taken attention away from all the other excavations we were undertaking at the site. So directly on top of the eastern side of the Balang, there's this little platform here. And because we didn't learn our lesson in 2023, digging in the exact same place we found burials before, we found more burials. And so we had to bring the APSARA back again. And these ones differ because what we've dated all of the burials to is late Yuan or early Ming. And these ones were all coelodons. There were no blue and whites among them. So what we're thinking, we're not quite sure how they ended up here. We're not quite sure who brought them. But it's more than likely still that this Balang was what we think is, it was deconstructed. The pieces were used to build the other one. And then someone recognizing the sacredness of this site interred these burials before whatever vandalism happened to it later. So in conclusion, our studies of ancient Buddhist terrace substructures, reliquary monuments, transformed temples, and mortuary remains of Angkor Thom illustrate a unique and localized adoption of Theravada Buddhism at Angkor Thom, as vihear began to supplant the Cambodian Hindu prasat as the focal point of Cambodian socio-political organization. Through our fieldwork, we've witnessed how populations interacted with and negotiated the existing temple landscape through each new Theravadin construction, processes which are reflected in the cumulative, layered palimpsest monuments seen within Angkor Thom today. Excavations, carbon dates, ceramic analysis, and architectural research confirm the complex histories of vihear sites, both prior to and following the major period of monastic construction during the 13th and 16th centuries, as well as the existence of pluralistic religious society in transition during the period in which Jodaguan visited Angkor. Thus, our research serves as a fascinating, important, and most notably visible case study for cultural and religious change in the archaeological record, processes which have been observed at more prominent centers of the ancient world, such as Roman Athens in the West, and in centers of Lopburi or Sitep in Southeast Asia, among others. Over the next few years, we hope to fully complete post-excavation artifact analysis, soil flotation, and radiocarbon dating work on material from our 2023 and 2024 seasons, and which will no doubt provide further nuance to these discussions and investigations, especially through further study of the remains of ATV-9. I've listed some directions the project could go in the future based on fieldwork we've completed, although the 2024 campaign currently represents our last planned season of fieldwork for the Angkor Vihara Project. So thank you very much for listening today, and I'd be happy to answer any questions, especially in regard to what we found in 2024. And I'll leave you with a quick site overview of what we did this season at completely exposing the staircase. So that is trench 4000, all done, all the way across. And what we found is another phase of construction, as you can see in the molded sandstone here. So clearly these blocks are built on top, and that's something that we're riddling through at the moment. So thank you very much, everyone, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. His topic, I think, is very important to understand the transition of the religions from Mahayana to Theravada Buddhism in Cambodia. And because when we try to understand the 13th and 14th century history and archaeology in this period, normally we use art history rather than archaeological evidence. We know very little. So his work excavated many sites. So I think we better understand. So if you have any question, you can ask Dr. Andrew. Do you have any question? Okay, please wait the microphone. Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you for a very informative presentation. I have two questions. The first one is that you mentioned at some point there is a stone turtle with thousands of foundations and stones, and those foundation stones were found in some of the sites. I wonder if you could elaborate on the symbolism of the stone turtle in Buddhism, and how does those foundation stone means when they change different sets of religion. So that's question number one. Question number two is maybe just due to my lack of understanding of terminologies. You mentioned about monasteries. My understanding is within a Buddhist monastery, you had buildings such as upasat, and then you have buildings vihara. And sama stone is usually only around upasat. And then you also mentioned the word terraces. Like, do you mean vihara without the walls, or do you mean vihara with collapsed wall that look like a... Yeah, I'm a bit confused about the function of when you say Vihara project. Are we talking about building without the wall, or talking about separate spaces that was meant to be without roof? Yeah, just wondering about what they were used for. Thank you.
So to answer the first question quickly, the turtle, what we think now, this was found at the base of a number of hydraulic features. For example, there was recently one that was found at a pond in the Bayon. And these turtles are thought to both represent water, but also represent the churning of the ocean of milk, which is not necessarily something ascribed to Hinduism or Buddhism, but something that's sort of pan-Indic. And in this myth, I'll say very simply, is that the Devas wanted to block the Asuras from achieving mortality by creating the elixir of life, so essentially partnered with them, spun this naga, Vasaki, around a turning post, or called Mount Mandarachala, to create the elixir, but the mountain began to sink in the sea. And so what you have is Vishnu, in his avatar form, he was overseeing everything, turned into a turtle, Kurma, and supported the mountain. So that the symbolism of the turtle is thought to relate to Vishnu, which again, we're talking about the pluralistic religion in the practices of the medieval Khmer, is that there wasn't necessarily a Shiva period, a Vishnu period, a Bodhisattva period. If you look at temple inscriptions, there are elites giving alms, giving statues of numerous deities. So you have a far more complicated relationship. You can't necessarily ascribe it to one thing or the other. As for the foundation stones, that actually is a good question, but it is something that we have found continuously. And I think there has been very little work aside from recognizing them. One of the major deposits of these stones, that we find them sometimes at the sites that we excavate at. The most of them have been found around this one Banti Kide area. And there's got to be some importance, possibly of a local tradition there. But again, that's a good question that I think further research will illuminate. As for the second question, I think there's something very unique about Angkorian Vihara. Everything is focalized on a single space. You're right. Ubosat are typically the ordination spaces with sema stones. And for a long time, it was thought that these were ordination halls, but then it became apparent, because there were no vihara that would have served this function, or very few, that this was a distinctly Angkorian tradition. This was something like temples that had focalized all rituals into a single structure. One thing we don't know much about are the supporting structures within these monastic complexes. We know that they were walled. We know that there were these vihara, what we call vihara, within them, but the wooden structures that form the monks' quarters, the tower, the eating hall, anything like this, they're not made out of stone. It's not like in say, for example, Sri Lanka, where you would walk through one of the Theravada monasteries and everything would still be there. This is the one monument that is built out of stone. And a lot of scholars have thought there's some symbolism to that, in the sense that this is a thing anchored into the ground, similar to a temple. And so there's some continuity in the ideation of religious space. As for what the vihara is, we're talking about the vihara, or the Khmer preah vihear. As I mentioned, the terrace is the surviving substructures. You saw that the walls are gone, the roof is collapsed. But the preah vihear, or the vihara, is the space in which these rites were undertaken. These monks were ordained, the novices were ordained, and most importantly, people congregated. It was a major center of congregation for communities. So when I say vihara, I do say the space in which these rites were undertaken, rather than referring to a terrace, which is a very archaeological term, a very antiquated archaeological term when we use it. But because it is the term that stuck for 100 years, It's the one we still use to describe these complexes. When I've been trying to say we should call them preah vihear, because that preah vihear essentially is a literal translation is old church or old hall. So I think that's kind of my long-winded answer to that question.
Thank you. I have a question.
Yeah.
During your archaeological survey, did you find like some habitation sites around Vihara?
We found earlier ones actually. There's one of the cool things, and if you're at SPAFA on Monday or Tuesday, you'll hear my collaborator Chai Rachna talk on this. Is one thing that he's found is not necessarily habitation related to the vihara itself. Obviously, there's a little bit of debris, flotsam, jetsam, things that are related to activity, but it's this earlier occupation that's interesting. What we might have found is we might have identified a sort of sphere of occupation surrounding the biome. There are occupation mounds that predate the terrace that are chock-a-block full of goods, or full of ceramics, full of charcoal, and then others which have been identified as occupation mounds further east across the site where there's nothing. So he's going to go into that. He will go into that more, but that's the type of occupation we found. It's not contiguous. It's not contemporary with the vihara. It's actually before it, and that allows us to understand why vihara were constructed where they were. And as also I mentioned with ATV 12 and ATV 30, there is evidence that the placement of sites like this are not arbitrary. So it's much more about what came before than what came contemporarily, at least for what we found so far. But definitely something that we were surprised not to find more evidence of.
Thank you. It seemed to me that normally when every scholar talk about the collapse of the Angkor, they also the main factor was Ayutthaya attack. Do you find some evidence that relate to this phenomenon in Angkor Thom or Angkor Wat area?
Very recently, but we don't know. We have to carbon date this layer. We found and I've never found this before. We found an ash layer, but it was below the new Balang. So they built on top of the ash layer. So we don't know what it is. Maybe at some point we'll find out. We'll be able to date when that happened. But it's the idea of a, what can I say? The idea that there was an occupation by Ayutthaya of an area where the elites had already left to the south is far more feasible than, say, an episode or an event, I think. And that's why we talk about it as a single factor in several factors.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
I think okay.
So you
Please.
mentioned that the 13th and 14th century were marked in the region where you worked in by political upheaval as well as extreme climatic weather conditions.
Mm-hmm.
Could you elaborate a little bit further on this, but particularly in general, but particularly on the buildings the digging you have done? Do you find any traces of that in the place, or is this more like kind of a general theory you talk about?
Well, one of the things that we've it's not necessarily what we can identify through the soil. We haven't gone into the metabar coating of the soil, for example. But one thing that that's very unique is just the sheer number of vihara within Angkor Thom. The idea that if there were populations that were living within the Angkor region, they appear to have done most of their construction during this period within the citadel or right around it. So we talk about the collapse of low density urbanism. We talk about that no longer having the similar hydrology. There have been studies within the moat of Angkor Thom that almost run contrary to the idea that there was more occupants. It's very confusing because there's so many different lines of evidence that point to a correlation, but they don't necessarily point in a straight line. And I'll give you an example. At the University of Sydney, the scholar named Dan Penny did some soil coring in the moat surrounding Angkor Thom. And what he found through carbon dating and through through looking at these soil cores is that the moat of Angkor Thom was swamp-like by the 15th century, and by 14th century was already beginning to be overgrown. Meanwhile, we have this bumper crop abundance of vihara construction going on at the same time. So are the people that are constructing the vihara watching their moat become stagnant? Like and there's also less evidence of things being grown within Angkor Thom. Where do the vihara sit within this narrative? And that's confusing because it's a parallel process, but it doesn't necessarily seem to be as cut and dry as it should be, because if that was the idea that Angkor was slowly being depopulated, you would find less. The carbon dates related to Vihara would be mostly in the 12th and 13th century and would be something that came along with Mahayana Buddhism. What we do have as evidence for the collapse of the hydraulic systems that fueled various processes within Greater Angkor is just continuous recycling of stone into these new foundations. Very jarringly so sometimes. Most of the structures we've looked at have recycled stone. They've been recycled from something close by. They've been recycled from a structure that doesn't exist anymore. And so there are a lot of, and this is why I like to say that the spread of Theravada monasticism within Angkor Thom is a parallel process to what happened, because it doesn't necessarily correlate. There's no cause and effect, but it's happening at the same time. And there's evidence of it.
Yeah, thank you. We have a little time, right? So do you have any question? We can, ask him two more questions around that. Cut.
You mentioned about the ceramics that you guys found and how the colors were significant,
Mm-hmm.
the blue, green, as opposed to white. And did you mention something about in the last site to do with burial ceramics? Could you re-explain that bit about how the color relates to the use of those ceramics?
Oh, it's honestly just I was noting that that we had celadon rather than blue and white. That has nothing to do with any symbolism or anything like that. That's just we found this it was sort of more of an observation. We found this lovely blue and white vessel jarlet. It's actually a very common motif on export ceramics. They found numerous numbers of them on shipwrecks and in the Philippines and terrestrial sites. But most of what we found were these celadon ceramics, and in terms of color symbolism, there's nothing we could say aside for Jodagwan saying the Khmer were absolutely crazy about celadon. But what we think is, and based on the style, based on what we know of trade ceramics at the time, these were 14th century ceramics. But at that point, there were little to no blue and white ceramics within any occupation up until the 16th century. There's a number of ways we could go with how to interpret this find. Like I mentioned, it could have been something that was directly related to the positioning of the older balang. It could have been something that was deposited prior to this, whatever was on top of the cruciform was being deserted. But then you also have the ceramics that are found underneath, so we think that's a later burial. But again, there's no distinct connection between color and style rather than just sort of historical seriation. And we don't know whether as well, these would have all been before what's called the Ming Gap, if any of you know your ceramic history, where Chinese ceramics was simply not exported for a certain period of time. So they would have come to Cambodia before that point, or even through a down the line trade, likely not considering how many connections there were. But they could have come to Angkor during the 16th century for all we know. And because we're respectful, we didn't take any of the charcoal out to carbon date it, because that could be somebody. So leave them there.
Thank you. One more question? Yep.
Just a quick question. What is the balang?
Balang. Oh, okay. So I mentioned that previously. A balang is the central pedestal in which the major deity or Buddha would have sat. And so it's a big square thing, and it's what's the similar type? Sorry? Para. Similar, right? Mm-hmm. So that, yes. Balang. Yeah, with a little over the end. Yeah.
Okay, I think it's time to finish our talk today.
Yes.
We I feel the topic is very interesting because this period sometime in Thailand we call the dark age. So because we know a little about why the religion changed from Mahayana to Theravada Buddhism. So today we would like to thank you very much for your presentation and give the great knowledge about the history and archaeology work in Cambodia.
The great thing is just the tip of the iceberg, and there's so many good projects going on right now that'll fill in the gaps.
Okay. We have some souvenir.
Well, thank you.